The Warhammer universe is known for being incredibly dark, but with all of these dark elements, there's context that makes them make sense. However, there's one particular story that has become kind of infamous in the 40k community. It's known as the Bloodtide, and it's got just about everything a grimderp story needs. It's relentlessly gory and dark to an obscene level. It's got characters making dumb decisions, and a solution that leaves the reader completely baffled. The story is so ridiculous that people are even starting to question whether or not it's even canon, even though Games Workshop has never made a statement on it. So in this video, we're gonna dive into what the Bloodtide actually was, whether or not it's still canon, and what retcons actually look like in the context of the 40k universe. Okay, so what even was the Bloodtide? So the Bloodtide was actually an ancient device from the Dark Age of technology. It was a massive swarm of nanobots that carried with them a horrific blood disease that was incredibly contagious, and once infected, all of the victims' blood would burst out of every orifice on their body. The purpose of this thing was to, quote, drown entire worlds in blood. And honestly, that checks out. Sounds like a 40k doomsday weapon to me. Apparently, the Bloodtide was even self-aware, and was able to merge many of these bots into a vaguely humanoid shape in which it was able to communicate with people. It was unleashed on an unsuspecting world and killed the entirety of its population, which was around 10 billion people. Now there it would remain dormant for thousands of years before being rediscovered by the Dark Mechanicum, and then later being utilized by a demon prince of the Alpha Legion who unleashed it on 1,000 more worlds, before the Bloodtide would inevitably go dormant once again. So this is one of the major storylines of the novel Hunt for Valdorus, which was written by Andy Hoare. But I'm gonna be completely honest with you, I have not read this particular book yet. So we're just going with the summary of it here. And if you wanna know more about this thing, you should definitely check it out. Now, that's all well and good. Super doomsday weapons that drown planets in blood, nothing out of the ordinary there for 40k lore. However, the Bloodtide would show up once again in the 5th edition Grey Knights Codex. And this was the last time that it was mentioned, and it's by far one of the most infamous things in all of 40k. You see, thousands of years later, the Bloodtide would come under the possession of a Khorne bloodthirster known as, alright, I'm gonna do my best here. Kajaganath. Kajaganath? Kajaganath, that sounds about right. Listen, words are hard for me to begin with, but when you throw demon words into the mix, all bets are off. So Kajaganath was imprisoned upon the world of Van Horn. He broke free and unleashed the Bloodtide upon its population, causing its citizens to descend in a gore frenzy of rampant bloodletting and slaughter for 8 days straight. On the 9th day, the Sisters of the Ebon Chalice were dispatched to put an end to him. However, a large portion of them would inevitably become corrupted by the Bloodtide. The Bloodthirster was only stopped when the Grey Knights arrived, but the way they managed to defeat him was pretty controversial to say the least. You see, they slaughtered the remaining uncorrupted sisters and used their sacred blood mixed with holy oils to create warding talismans. These talismans were painted on their armor and allowed them to resist the Bloodtide's corruption. Okay, so just to recap, the Grey Knights slaughtered their allies for their blood in order to use that blood to fight a blood demon of the Blood God who was attempting to drown worlds in oceans of blood. The irony was completely lost on them. So for a lot of people, this event falls into the category of something that's being dark just for the sake of being dark, which honestly, sometimes that can be fun. And like I said, if it's not your cup of tea, I totally understand that. But in my experience, there's no way of talking about this thing without 100 people coming out of the woodwork to let you know that it has in fact been retconned. And I know about this personally as I mentioned it briefly in one of my 1-minute videos and I got a whole bunch of comments correcting me, letting me know that it wasn't canon anymore. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that one of my favorite things to do is hang out in the comment section and talk with you guys about Warhammer. So I asked quite a few of these individuals if they could point out a source for the retcon. But not a single one of these people was able to actually point me to the new source of the lore. And this doesn't happen very often, because Warhammer fans love talking about Warhammer and they love showing off just how much they know about Warhammer. I've definitely been guilty of this myself. And I know that sounds super arrogant and it would be ridiculous to expect every single person to pull up a list of sources whenever they're just talking about 40k. I've read around 100 novels at this point and I get the sources of different events mixed up constantly. It happens, but I thought this phenomena of literally hundreds of people telling me that it had been retconned without being able to point to the story that replaced it pretty interesting. You see, when I get corrected, I do my due diligence to try to track down the primary source in order to confirm if it's true or not. And if it is, I totally change my way of thinking based on it. But this one had me stumped. So I did a whole lot of digging, and I believe the source of the retcon comes down to a single Reddit post, where the author claims that it's been retconned based on 3 major facts. The first is that this story was only printed in a single Grey Knights codex and didn't show up in later edition. The second is that in the 7th edition codex, a story was printed that shows the Grey Knights and the sisters working side by side and everything is great and nobody's getting sacrificed for their holy blood. The third, and this is probably the most important one, was because it was just stupid to begin with. And hey, maybe this author is 100% right. Maybe Games Workshop did quietly sweep it under the rug without addressing it. But if I'm being honest, I'm not convinced. This isn't how retcons normally work in 40k. It's very rare that something that was considered canon is just suddenly not part of the lore anymore without any alternatives being given. When a retcon happens, it's normally a recontextualization of an event. The same story will be told from a different point of view that gives new information and offers a different perspective. This is actually a really smart way of doing this, because it doesn't discredit the old lore or completely pretend like it didn't happen. A story that was written in 2009 may be revisited in 2022. But who do you trust, the original perspective or this new one? Or do you have to find some kind of middle ground between them? Now, that's not to say that retcons don't happen all the time, because Warhammer is a universe that's kind of all over the place, so they definitely do. Another common form of retconning is when new characters are introduced to help flesh out certain events and storylines. This is what happened with one such character, Urda, who was a perpetual and by all accounts is the mother of the Primarchs. Or the geneticist known as Astartes, who helmed the Space Marine project and helped bring the Space Marines into existence. And additionally, this is where they get the name Astartes from. Or even looked at the character Belisarius Cawl, who apparently is 10,000 years old and has had his hand in just about everything the Imperium has ever done, yet wasn't mentioned for the first time until around 2017. That being said, I absolutely love Cawl. He's the best character in all of 40k, don't at me. So the major point I'm trying to get across with these examples is that these are true 40k retcons, where the information that we previously had is shown to be limited in scope, and new characters or new information is added to flesh it out further. It's in these moments that we can truly tell that something has been changed, because we can see the old lore versus the new lore and find where the differences are. Let's examine a few more examples. The Primaris Marines being immune to corruption and immune to things like the Blood Angels Black Rage, and then Games Workshop suddenly releasing Primaris Death Company, being like, oopsie doopsie, I guess they aren't totally immune after all. That's a retcon. The Necron species being little more than soulless killing machines that show up to purge all life and then vanish without a trace, and then in 5th edition being completely fleshed out, being given the ability to speak, having all of their dynasties and their unique personalities being brought to the forefront, and having just about everything about them be completely overhauled, that's a retcon. Or how about the fact that Firstborn Marines who cross the Rubicon and become Primaris have a survival rate of something like 1 in 100? This is what we have been told since the Primaris came out. But then when Godblight released, it had an offhanded comment near the end of the novel that basically said Belisarius Cawl had perfected the transition. And now basically every Firstborn Marine that decides to become Primaris does so without the risk of a horrific death. These are retcons. Looking back at the Bloodtide example from earlier, a story just not being reprinted again is not something I would consider a retcon. If this was the case, then the introduction of the 9th edition codex format would have retconned enormous amounts of lore, as previous editions always included a lore segment for every unit in the army. In 9th edition, this section was completely removed, something that I'm still kinda honestly salty about, as it was my favorite part of reading a codex. However, in fairness, this was probably done because Crusade got added to the game, and I'm just assuming that they have a certain amount of pages that have to be in the book, and they can't really go over that limit, so something had to go. So if our definition of a retcon includes something from a previous edition not showing up in the new one, does that mean that the introduction of the new Orc Codex retconned all of the lore for Stormboys, Ludas, Knobs, Gretchen, and just about everything else? Is none of that considered canon anymore? Personally, I think that's kind of ridiculous. Now, I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. And in the author's defense, this is not always the case, as we saw the Necron Pariahs quietly removed a few editions ago, and Games Workshop never really addressed this. This to me introduces the concept of soft and hard retcons, where an event being recontextualized would be considered a hard retcon, and something kinda just not being mentioned for a while would be more of a soft one. Now, in my opinion, I believe that we should draw a distinction between lore from the game and lore from the novels. I personally think the Pariahs were shelved because they didn't really fit the gameplay design that the Codex authors had going forward. But since everything in-game has lore attached to it, its removal kinda creates a vacuum. But that being said, without hard evidence that Games Workshop considers them to have never existed, we should then assume that they did at one point but are not utilized anymore. So in the case of a soft retcon like that of the pariahs, it would be my belief that they did in fact exist. They were definitely a real thing at one point, but for whatever reason they're just no longer seen within the dynasties. Until they come out with a hard and fast, this is why they are not around anymore, they all died, or the Necrons decided they weren't worth utilizing, or hell, maybe everyone who ever saw one was just having a wild fever dream, or whatever. Until that happens, I would still consider them canon. The lore on them is just kinda shady. And who knows, maybe Games Workshop is planning on reintroducing them to the lore sometime in the future, so it didn't really make a lot of sense to come up with a story on why they were all wiped out. Another major retcon is the Leagues of Votan or the Squats. And as of the time of recording this video, their new codex has been announced, but we still haven't gotten our hands on it. And if you didn't know, the Squats used to be part of the game in way earlier editions, but were subsequently removed as 40K kinda wanted to distance itself from its fantasy origins. A story was quickly thrown together about how they were all eaten by Tyranids. And although this is kinda dumb, it did give us a canonical reason why they weren't around anymore. And I think that's incredibly important. Even if it's just a few quick throwaway lines, it at least gives us context on why something is no longer in the setting. I would be willing to bet money that when that book does come out, the Tyranid invasion of the Squat homeworlds is not something they're just going to kinda conveniently ignore. It's definitely going to be addressed in the lore section. I'm confident it's an event that's going to at least have a few paragraphs dedicated to it. That explains maybe the Nids did invade the Squat homeworlds, but they rebuilt. Or maybe they were completely successful in fighting off the Tyranid invasion, but then cut communications with the Imperium afterwards for unknown reasons. Probably because they didn't send any backup. Or there's 100 different other reasons they could give us. But as a proper retcon, it has to be addressed at least a little. At the end of the day, Games Workshop actually has a pretty amazing catch-all when it comes to lore inconsistencies. The authors of the Black Library tend to agree that everything is considered canon, but not everything is true. And honestly, I think this is kind of brilliant, because to me, the best part of 40K lore is its mystery. It makes you constantly question what you think you know, and leaves a lot of open space for some really interesting debates. But I'm also willing to admit that maybe the reason I like this so much is because I'm also a massive Dark Souls fan, and I absolutely love its esoteric way of telling a story. A lot of people will point to this as inconsistent writing, where multiple authors talk about the same event and each one has a different interpretation of it, but I actually kinda like this. I never really can tell who I can trust. It kinda adds a level of immersion to all of this 40K stuff. So what do I think a retcon of the Bloodtide event would actually look like? If we were introduced to a story from the perspective of the sisters that said something along the lines of, yes, they gave their blood to create the talisman, but it didn't kill them. However, they subsequently went on a penitent crusade, and that's why we haven't heard from them. They cut all contact with the Imperium and exist as their own faction. Or potentially they could come up with a story from the Grey Knight's perspective that said that all of the sisters were corrupted and that's why they were killed, but the event had been covered up as to not bring shame on the sisterhood. Or go in the complete opposite direction and claim that they sacrificed themselves in order to defeat the Bloodthirster. There's honestly 100 different ways they could address this without pretending like it just didn't happen. So this has been a very long-winded way of saying that for something to be retconned, it has to be readdressed and recontextualized. If it's just not spoken about for a long time, I consider it still part of the lore, especially when you consider that in the almost 600 novels that have been written about Warhammer 40K, there's a lot of stories, characters, and events that were basically a one-time thing. And despite the fact that those things were never addressed again, we still consider all of them to be canon. So from my perspective, we should treat the Bloodtide the exact same way. Just because something hasn't been reprinted doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore, as I'm pretty sure Games Workshop is aware at this point that that is a horrible way of retconning something, because Warhammer fans never forget. If you enjoyed this video and you want to help me make more, I do have a Patreon, and I'm getting the impression that I'm supposed to mention it at the end of every video because that's what I see other YouTubers do. I do offer an exclusive podcast on there as well as a way to get miniatures from yours truly. But at the end of the day, you don't have to. This channel got monetized incredibly quickly, so I can actually treat this like a full-time job now, and that's wild to me. If you had told me 2 years ago I would actually be living my dream and making Warhammer content full-time, I would have told you were crazy. So thank you all again for hanging out with me and watching my videos all the way through. You, honest to God, you have no idea how much it means to me. Until next time, happy wargaming.